right, let's jump right in, shall we? Today, we're diving deep into an event from the American Civil War that's got it all. Action, intrigue, bravery, you name it. It's the Great Locomotive Chase. And the sources you sent over really zero in on the story of Private Philip G. Shadrach, a Medal of Honor recipient.
Oh, definitely a story for the ages.
We'll be using Shadrach's story as a springboard to explore the broader context of the Civil War, how technology changed the game, and how we've come to view courage and sacrifice over time.
It's a story that really captures, the desperate ingenuity of the Civil War, a conflict where both sides were constantly looking for any edge they could get.
Absolutely. So picture this. It's 1862, the war is in full swing, and the Union that's the North are locked in a brutal fight with the Confederacy, the southern states who broke away. Railroads, still relatively new at this point, are already crucial to the whole war effort.
Oh, railroads were like the lifeblood of warfare in the 19th century. Moving troops, supplies, all over huge distances. Control the railroads, you control the war, basically. That's why disrupting those lines was so huge for both sides.
High stakes. And that brings us to James J. Andrews, a civilian spy working for the Union. He cooks up this wildly ambitious plan. Steal a Confederate locomotive and use it to tear up a vital rail line deep in enemy territory.
And it wasn't just about wrecking tracks or bridges. It was about cutting off those Confederate supplies, delaying reinforcements, throwing everything into chaos. The Western and Atlantic Railroad was the target, the lifeline for the Confederate Army in the West.
And for this mission, Andrews puts together a team of 22 volunteers, including, of course, our main man from the sources, Private Philip G. Shadrach.
What strikes me about these volunteers, especially Shadrach, is the sheer risks they were taking on. Born in Pennsylvania, orphaned young, Shadrach enlisted at 21. Gotta figure, a sense of duty to his country really drove him.
It's hard to even fathom, putting yourself in their shoes. These weren't traditional soldiers. They were spies working behind enemy lines, knowing if they got caught. Execution was pretty much guaranteed.
Yeah, and back in the 1800s, spies weren't treated the same as uniformed soldiers. They were seen as saboteurs operating outside the rules of war, and that meant death was often the penalty.
So April 12th, 1862, mark the date. Andrews and his raiders, dressed like ordinary civilians, board a train called the General in Big Shanty, Georgia. They're biding their time, waiting for their chance, and then, when the train stops for breakfast...
Bam! Opportunity strikes. They overpower the crew, uncouple the locomotive, and they're off, racing north, tearing up the railroad as they go.
It was a meticulously planned operation. I mean, they weren't just joyriding. Cutting telegraph wires, ripping up tracks, even having to dodge other trains on the same line, thinking on their feet constantly, adapting. Amazing.
This is where you see the raid's connection to how warfare was changing. The Great Locomotive Chase, you could argue, is an early form of what we now call unconventional warfare, guerrilla warfare. Small, mobile units creating havoc behind enemy lines, a concept that becomes huge in later conflicts.
But there's another layer to this story, isn't there? It's not just about military tactics. It's about the human drama, stories of individual courage and sacrifice that still resonate with us today.
For sure. And that's where Philip Shadrach and the other raiders come in. Their willingness to risk everything for what they believed in, that says a lot about who they were, about those times.
They've got the locomotive, they're sabotaging the line. What happens next? The sources mention a chase.
Well, you gotta understand, the General's conductor, William Fuller, this guy was nothing if not determined. He wasn't about to let them just steal his train and get away with it.
He gives chase.
Oh, he gives chase, all right. First on foot. Then he gets a hold of a handcart. The guy's relentless. And finally, he manages to commandeer a whole string of locomotives. And that's when the real epic chase begins. It's this back and forth duel along miles and miles of Georgia Railroad. The raiders trying to outrun him, sabotaging as they go, Fuller hot on their heels, dead set on catching them.
It's like something straight out of an action movie.
You said it. But unlike in the movies, the stakes here were incredibly high. Not just for the raiders, but for the whole war effort. This wasn't just about a stolen train. It was about Confederate pride, proving to the Union that their infrastructure wasn't as vulnerable as it seemed.
And for the raiders, it was about survival, plain and simple. They knew capture meant no mercy.
And tragically, that's exactly what happens. As the chase goes on, the raiders run into more and more obstacles. Damaged tracks, unexpected trains, their supplies dwindling. They were literally running out of steam.
So they're running low on fuel, Fuller's breathing down their necks. What happens next?
Well, with supplies running out and Fuller closing in, they had no choice. They had to abandon the general just south of the Tennessee border. They scattered into the woods, hoping to disappear, maybe make their way back to Union lines.
But they didn't know that area at all, right? Must have made escape even harder.
Oh yeah, the Georgia backwoods were totally unfamiliar territory. They were on their own, no local guides or anything. And you got to remember, the South had all these local militias, civilians even, ready to help catch escaped Union soldiers.
Our sources focus on Private Shadrach, but what about the others? What happened to the rest of the raiders?
The aftermath of the raid, it's a mix of everything. Escape, capture, imprisonment, and executions, unfortunately. Andrews and 7 of his men, Shadrach included, were caught, tried as spies, and hanged. Buried in unmarked graves at first, which just adds to the tragedy of it all.
Really drives home the brutal reality of war. These men weren't just fighting for an idea, they were fighting to survive.
And for those who were captured, the ordeal didn't end with the hanging. Some were held as prisoners of war, and Confederate prisons were notoriously harsh. Some were lucky enough to be part of prisoner exchanges, eventually making it back to Union territory.
But it wasn't a total loss, right? Some of the raiders did escape, and they went on to receive the Medal of Honor.
That's right. 6 of them made it back to Union lines and were awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration for valor in the U.S. These men: William Bensinger, Robert Buffum, Elihu Mason, Wilson W. Brown, Daniel A. Dorsey, and Martin J. Hawkins. They were actually the very first recipients of this brand new award.
That's huge. To be the first to receive such a prestigious honor, I mean, that really speaks volumes about the impact of what they did. But what about those who were captured and executed? What about their legacy?
Well, that's where things get interesting. For over a century, those who were executed as spies, including Philip Shadrach, they were mostly forgotten. Their sacrifice kind of overshadowed by the success of those who escaped and got recognition.
That almost seems unfair, considering the incredible risks they all took.
It does make you think about how we choose to remember and honor sacrifice, especially in war. It's a reminder that history isn't always neat and tidy. Recognition can come late, even for extraordinary courage.
It wasn't until much later that their sacrifices started to be recognized.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to how our understanding and interpretation of history changes over time. In 2024, over 150 years after the Great Locomotive Chase, 2 of the executed raiders, Philip Shadrach and George D. Wilson, were posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor.
Must have been an incredibly powerful moment for their families, for their descendants, to finally see their loved ones recognized and honored after all those years.
It was a symbolic gesture, acknowledging their bravery, their willingness to give their lives for their country. And it also reflects a broader shift in how we think about war, espionage, and the sacrifices made by those who operate in the shadows.
It makes you think about the whole idea of heroism. These men were condemned as criminals in their own time, but history has come to see them as patriots, heroes who dared to take on a powerful enemy.
And their story challenges our definition of courage. Is it about winning? Or is it about facing impossible odds for something you believe in, even when you don't know how it'll turn out?
It's clear these raiders believed in something bigger than themselves. What do the sources tell us about their motivations? What made them sign up for such a dangerous mission?
Well, we talked about Philip Shadrach's background as an orphan. You can imagine that might have instilled in him a deep sense of duty, a need to find his place, his purpose. But the motivations of the other raiders were probably just as diverse and complex.
Do we have any clues about what those motivations might have been?
While our sources really zoom in on Shadrach, it makes sense to think a whole bunch of factors played a role. Some might have been driven by fiery patriotism, a belief in saving the Union and ending slavery. Others, maybe they were drawn to the adventure of it, the thrill of danger, the chance to prove themselves.
It was a different world back then. Patriotism and duty meant something different. It's fascinating to try to understand what would make a blacksmith from Ohio, a farmer from Illinois, a shopkeeper from Pennsylvania leave their lives behind and embark on such a crazy, dangerous journey.
Right. It reminds us that history is made up of individuals, each with their own stories, motivations, dreams. And sometimes those individual stories collide in extraordinary ways, creating events that change the course of nations.
Speaking of extraordinary, we've talked about the raid itself, the chase, the tragic consequences. But what was the real impact of the Great Locomotive Chase on the war? Was it actually a strategic win for the Union?
Well, It didn't achieve its main goal, which was to cripple the Western and Atlantic Railroad, but its impact went beyond the immediate damage. The chaos and disruption it caused, even for a short time, did have some real effects. Confederate communications were messed up, troop movements were delayed, supplies slowed down, all of which gave the Union Army a window of opportunity.
So it wasn't just a symbolic act of defiance, it actually has some concrete, even if limited, military consequences.
Exactly. The raid exposed the vulnerability of Confederate infrastructure, forced them to pour resources into protecting their supply lines, and it had a big psychological impact on both sides.
How so?
For the Confederacy, it was a huge humiliation. Having their own locomotive used against them like that, their whole logistics network exposed as vulnerable, it was a major blow to their pride. It made them question their ability to secure their own territory.
And what about the Union side?
Well, for them, it was a huge morale boost. The Union had suffered a string of defeats in the early years of the war. Even though it ultimately failed, the Great Locomotive Chase showed that the North could strike deep into enemy territory and disrupt their war effort. It was a story of daring and ingenuity, a sign that the Union wasn't going to back down without a fight.
So this relatively small-scale raid, carried out by a handful of volunteers, had ripple effects that went way beyond the immediate events.
Absolutely. It became a symbol of Union resistance, a story that captured the public imagination and reinforced their belief in the cause. And it highlighted the growing importance of unconventional warfare, something that would become more and more relevant in future conflicts.
The story of the Great Locomotive Chase is more than just a thrilling adventure. It's a window into the complexities of war, the evolving nature of heroism, and how individual stories can shape our understanding of the past. Wow, we've covered so much ground in this deep dive. From the vital role railroads played in the Civil War to James J. Andrews' audacious plan, the incredible bravery of those raiders, especially Private Philip G. Shadrach.
Definitely.
But you know what really sticks with me? The human element, the individual choices these men made when faced with such extraordinary circumstances.
Yeah, it's easy to look back now and analyze the tactics, the successes, the failures of the raid. But the real power of the Great Locomotive Chase, I think, is how it connects us to the past on this really personal level.
You're right. We talked about their motivations, their sacrifices, their legacy. But it boils down to one question, really. What would I have done in their shoes?
That's the question that lingers, yeah. Knowing the risks, the slim chance of pulling it off, the very real possibility of death, would I have had the guts to volunteer?
To leave everything you know behind, family, work, and go deep into enemy territory on a mission that could easily get you killed. It's hard to even imagine.
Right. It challenges how we think today. We live in a world where risk is something to be calculated, minimized, insured against. For these men, risk was just part of life. It was a choice they made, not because they were reckless, but out of this deep sense of duty, conviction, maybe even a thirst for adventure.
And in a way, that makes their story even more powerful, more relevant to us today, because it reminds us that even when we're scared, when things are uncertain, there are times when ordinary people have to do extraordinary things.
The Great Locomotive Chase happened over 150 years ago, but the questions it raises about courage, sacrifice, what humans can endure, those are timeless. It makes us look at our own values, our beliefs, and ask ourselves what we'd be willing to fight for.
And beyond the big picture of war and heroism, it's those little details, the glimpses into the lives of these men that really bring the story to life. Philip Shadrach, the orphan who enlisted to find his place. James J. Andrews, the civilian spy master with this crazy plan. William Fuller, the stubborn conductor who wouldn't give up. These weren't just names in a history book. They were real people making choices that shaped the world we live in.
Exactly. And by exploring their stories, digging into the sources you shared, we get a deeper understanding not just of the past, but of ourselves too. We connect with something essential about what it means to be human, that capacity for courage, resilience, striving for something bigger than ourselves.
Well said. As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm just in awe of the men who were part of the Great Locomotive Chase. They've left a mark on history that won't be forgotten.
And as we move forward, their story reminds us that the fight for freedom, for justice, for a better world often demands incredible courage and a willingness to face the unknown.
It's a story that'll stay with me, and I hope it stays with you too. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the past.